The year was 1839 when a Portuguese ship anchored off the coast of Sierra Leone and rowed to shore in smaller boats. They were looking for Africans illegally to capture and enter into the slave trade. A large group was captured and sent into the hold of the slave ship Tecora to be chained and sent off to an unknown future. The captured men and women were sent first to Havana, Cuba. Two Spanish merchants, Don Pedro Montes and Don Jose Ruiz, bought 53 men and women and 4 children illegally. They all boarded the Amistad and were either headed for their plantation near Puerto Príncipe in central Cuba or to sell off the captured Africans at different ports along the Cuban coast. Those two options were found doing research for this video. I'm not sure exactly which one was the most accurate. While traveling along the Cuban coast, the cook of the Amistad played a cruel joke on the captives. He told them they were going to be killed, salted, and then cooked. Sengbepe, also known as Joseph Cinquez once he reached America, was a Mende who was taken from Sierra Leone and transported on the Tecora. He managed to break free of his chains with a file found by another captive, and then released the other captives once he broke free of his bonds. The Amistad was captained by Ramon Ferreira. He had a personal servant on board. His name was Antonio. Once the captives were freed, they found boxes of cane knives in the hold of the ship, basically a large machete. The group first killed the ship's cook. Then the captain was also killed after he killed one of the Africans. 2 crew members managed to escape in the confusion. Antonio, the captain's servant, was spared, as well as the 2 Spaniards. The Mende would use them to sail back to Africa. 2 of the Africans were killed during the struggle to take over the ship. The ship had provisions for 4 days, but the ship was already behind schedule due to strong winds. Antonio was used as a translator between the Mende and Ruiz and Montes. If they sailed back to Africa, the Mende would spare their lives. Ruiz and Montes during the day would sail towards Africa, but at nighttime, when the Mende could not view the sun as a marker, they steered the schooner towards America in hopes that another Spanish ship would find them while passing through the shipping lanes. The Amistad was seen numerous times along the American coast. Many newspapers claimed that a ship full of African pirates was out along the coast. On August 21st, Amistad was spotted by multiple boats. The pilot boat, Blossom, spotted her 30 miles south of Sandy Hook. They saw a few dozen Africans on board. They got close, tied a line to the Amistad, and then the Mende asked for food and water. They gave them bread and water. But when a few of the men tried to get on board the Blossom, the crew cut the lines that was holding the 2 ships together, and then they went to report their findings, believing it was a slave ship. On August 23rd, the Gratitude spotted the Amistad and tried to speak with the crew. The captain of the Gratitude wanted to send one of his crew on board the Amistad, but then the Amistad fired at the Gratitude. She safely sailed away and reported her findings. The Amistad set anchor about a half-mile below Long Island on August 26th. They had been at sea for 2 months now, traveling towards the sunrise during the day and towards American coast at night. Once anchored, some of the Mende went on shore to find food and water near Montauk, New York, and traded with locals. 9 Mende had now died in total while at sea. 2 were killed during the revolt, and the rest died from lack of food and water while at sea. The United States Revenue Cutter Washington was conducting a hydrographic survey in the area when they spotted some Africans on shore and a suspicious schooner anchored. The commanding officer sent a boarding party to the Amistad. They eventually found out she was the Amistad, and the crew had been killed. They found Ruiz and Montes and took custody of the Amistad and the Africans. They were taken to New London, Connecticut by the Washington's officers. It's believed that the officers of the Washington took the Amistad to Connecticut instead of New York for a specific reason. Slavery in Connecticut was still legal. It eventually ended in 1848. A slew of court cases would be filed after the Amistad was seized. The first court case was by Lieutenant Thomas R. Gedney of the Washington, filing salvage rights in the federal district court. He wanted the African captives and the cargo as property seized on the high seas. Henry Green and Pelatiah Fordham wanted salvage rights, claiming that they had been the first to discover the Amistad. Jose Ruiz and Pedro Montes also filed requesting their property and cargo returned to them. The U.S. Attorney for the District Court of Connecticut represented the Spanish government. They wanted the slaves, cargo, and the Amistad to be returned to Spain since it was Spain's property. Antonio Vega asked for Antonio to be returned to him since Antonio was his property. The Africans on board the Amistad claimed they were neither slaves nor property and could not be returned as property. The issue with the Amistad was an international event and a heated topic in the United States. It even involved the president. Tensions were already high with the issue of slavery across America. The British government also pressured the United States to free the Africans. The British had entered into a treaty with Spain. It prohibited the slave trade north of the equator. The British minister in Washington, Henry Fox, wrote to the Secretary of State, John Forsyth, on behalf of Queen Victoria. Part of the letter says, "Now the unfortunate Africans, whose case is the subject of present representation, has been thrown by accidental circumstances into the hands of the authorities of the United States government. Whether these persons shall recover their freedom to which they are entitled, or whether they should be reduced to slavery, in violation of known laws and contract publicly passed, prohibiting the continuance of the African slave trade by Spanish subjects. It's under these circumstances that Her Majesty's government anxiously hopes that the President of the United States will find himself empowered to take such measures in behalf of the aforesaid Africans, as shall secure to them possession of their liberty, to which with no doubt they are by law entitled." The Secretary of State responded that the President could not influence the court case, and said that whether the Africans or the Amistad were enslaved in violation of the treaty was still an open one. He also stated that the courts found the Africans were Spanish property, they would be returned to Cuba, and then Great Britain and Spain could argue the question of the law and treaties between themselves. Joshua Levitt, Louis Tappan, Simeon Jocelyn formed the Amistad Committee. They were abolitionists. They raised money to help the Africans pay for their legal fees. No one could talk with the Mende, so Professor Willard Gibbs held up one finger in front of the Mende until they realized what he was trying to do. Then they spoke their word for one. He held up his second finger, then a third, and a fourth, until he reached 10 fingers. Now he knew how to count to 10 in their language. He went to the docks in New York, counting from 1 till 10 until he finally found somebody that could speak their language. He found a British Navy seaman, James Covey, a former slave who was now free from West Africa. He translated for the Mende. Now they could understand the Africans, and they learned their individual stories. They now knew for certain that they were mostly Mende and had been captured by fellow Africans and sold illegally into slavery. The leader of the revolt, Singbe, was a rice farmer. He had a wife and 3 children, and he was taken to repay a debt and sold to a Spanish slaver and then put on the slave ship Tecora. After the public heard their stories, they received much more sympathy and support. In September 1839, the Africans were charged with mutiny and murder. If convicted, they would almost certainly have been executed if returned to Spanish control. Antonio and the children were set to be witnesses. The district court judge was Andrew Judson. The abolitionists were very worried. He had been known as a tough judge who always ruled against any case involving slavery or African Americans. He had been appointed by Andrew Jackson. The U.S. represented Spain in this case. President Martin Van Buren, a Democrat who needed support from white Southerners to win the upcoming election sided with Spain's claims and did everything in his power to help Spain win. He even ordered a ship into the harbor to be ready after the court had made their decision, so he could send the Mende back to Cuba immediately before any appeals could be decided. This would have ended with the execution of the Mende once they reached Cuba. Roger Sherman Baldwin argued the case for the Mende. The court decision surprised everyone. Andrew Judson ruled in favor of the Mende. He rejected Spain's claims, which were argued by a U.S. attorney. He decided the Africans were neither slaves or Spanish subjects and were free under the laws of Spain. He dismissed Ruiz and Montes' claims for the cargo and the Africans. He ruled that Lieutenant Gedney would receive salvage rights, 1/3 of the property on the Amistad. The slave Antonio could be claimed by the Spanish Vice Consul since Antonio was born a slave and was now property of the captain's heirs. Telenacas, Aspe, and Laca would receive 1/3 salvage rights. He also decided that Green and Fordham would not receive salvage rights. Judson ordered the Mende be returned to Africa by the U.S. government. The law provided for the return of all illegally traded slaves. Antonio later escaped to Canada with help from abolitionists. President Martin Van Buren, on the behalf of the Spanish government, ordered the U.S. Attorney to appeal the case to the U.S. Circuit Court of Connecticut immediately. It's believed that the president didn't really have strong beliefs about slavery. His main goal was to win the election and not anger any Southern slaveholders. In 1840, the Circuit Court sided with Judson's decision. The only option in the president's mind was to move the matter up to the United States Supreme Court, so the U.S. Attorney appealed again to the highest court in the land. John Quincy Adams, a former president and member of the House of Representatives, was convinced by the abolitionists to argue the case on behalf of the Mende, along with Roger Sherman Baldwin, who argued the case in the prior two courts. This case began with the Attorney General Henry Gilpin arguing for the federal government. He argued that the Amistad's documents stated that the Africans were indeed slaves and Spanish property. Roger Sherman Baldwin then argued against this. The 73-year-old John Quincy Adams then argued that the president was abusing his powers and argued over the treaties that applied to this case. He spoke for 8.5 hours over multiple days. After the rebuttal from the U.S. Attorney General, the court retired. The court eventually gave its verdict on March 9, 1841. They voted 7-1 to uphold the prior court's decisions. The Mende had won. The majority's judgment was given by Justice Story. It is quite long, but I will go over some of the points that they wrote. You can find the full decision online, even the actual copy, but it is quite difficult to read. The court decided that the Mende had been kidnapped and were not slaves, therefore they were free. The treaty with Spain does not apply because of this. When the Amistad arrived, the Mende were in possession of the ship, and they were asserting their freedom. They did not import themselves here as slaves and for the sale of slaves. Our opinion is that the decree of the Circuit Court affirming that of the District Court ought to be affirmed, except so far as it directs the Negroes to be delivered to the President to be transported to Africa in pursuits of the Act of the 3rd of March, 1819, and as to this, it ought to be reserved, and that the said Negroes be declared to be free and dismissed from the custody of the court and go without delay. By the time the Supreme Court had decided the case, there were 36 surviving Africans. Even more had died while awaiting in jail. The original number was 53 when they first were forced onto the Amistad. The court would not order the government to send the Mende back to Africa, so abolitionists took the Mende in until the funds could be raised to send them home. In 1842, funds were raised and the Mende would be returning to Africa along with missionaries who wanted to start missions in Africa. It was discovered some of the surviving Mende belonged to different tribes who were involved in a civil war with one another, and many chiefs were also slave traders. Sengbe returned to Africa with the other survivors. Not much is known about his later life in Sierra Leone. Rumors spread that he himself became a slave trader, but these claims were almost certainly false. In 1997, Steven Spielberg directed the film titled Amistad. It brought the case back into the spotlight 158 years later. Thank y'all for watching. I hope you enjoyed and I hope you learned something. I sure did. All the court stuff is kind of hard to understand. I'm no lawyer, I'm no historian, but I get the gist of it. Eventually, the Mende won their freedom, and that's all that matters. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you on the next. Peace.